Hello, thank you for waiting for me. All right, let me get your names down. Okay, so today we are doing the third and fourth assignments. All right, on the Black Legend and on the Spanish colonizers. Right. So at any rate, I hope you guys are doing okay. I will very soon uh, begin to correct and grade your assignments so you can kind of gauge how you're meeting my kind of subjective expectations. All right. Before we begin, are there any questions? Have a good show out today. All right, so remember, as I write these, right, I almost feel as if I'm acting. I'm not uh, per per se. I'm not writing down my subjective takes myself on these topics. They represent something that I've read that I thought was interesting, etc. All right. And so recall, right, that we have a the term Hispanic. They don't like to use anymore because it comes from Hispania, the Roman Latin name for conquered Spain back in the Roman times. And so that just connotes the fact that, yes, the Spaniards won and colonized the Americas. And yes, they made a great effort to try to assimilate the Native Americans to things Spanish. And of course, the institutions they made in the mold of Spanish Castilian legacies. But nevertheless, even if they didn't want it to happen, syncretism happened, right? There was borrowing of culture and habits and institutions from each other, even if it was a bit heavily in the Spaniards' favor and made more in the likeness of Spain. That's why a lot of people prefer the term Latino to Hispanic today. But nevertheless, there's no doubting the fact that the Spaniards were pretty effective and successful in stamping Central and South America in their likeness. Okay, so I thought that necessitated a little coverage of Spain itself. So when you look at this first section, right, it's a pretty upfront thesis, right? It's actually a bit more informative than it is argumentative if you've read it. It just states, right, that there's almost no such thing as a just kind of homogenous Spaniard. Spain has had such a multi-ethnic past. It's so ethnically and nationally diverse that there really is no such thing as just like a quote pure Spaniard, because the Spaniards are going to try to act as if there were when they colonized the Americas. They had an actual policy that they tried to initiate in the Americas, and it was called cleanness of blood, limpieza de sangre. That you were supposed to be a pure Spaniard, to be the viceroy, to be one of the judges of the audiencia, to be a gobernador, a governor, uh, and a corregidor, the people that came to the local towns and demanded tribute and taxation and could overturn the city council and mayor's decisions. So that wasn't always the case. Philip II, for instance, he got broke and he began selling offices to the highest bidders. And some mestizo uh, gentlemen who were born to a Spaniard, oftentimes a Spaniard father and an indigenous mom, who had dad's acknowledgement as a son and money, were able to purchase offices as despite being mestizo, being half Native American. But they tried, right, with this cleanness of blood policy. And so at any rate, I'm showing a number one that that is absolutely historically virtually impossible that that was the case, right? So you have the Celtic people that came that the we usually use the term that the Greeks used for the first, the earliest or indigenous Spaniards, and that is Iberian. So to this day, right, Spain and Portugal is known as the Iberian Peninsula. So the native Iberians, right, we believe they're beginning to change their tune that perhaps maybe they engaged in the Neolithic or farming revolution, but they may not have. It may have been brought to them by the Celtic people. So the Celtic people came, right? And the Celtic people, by accounts, were uh, more of a kind of wasp uh, background and WASP appearance. And remember, that's white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, long before the Protestants, right? But it just basically implies a very like white English or Germanic European. And so, you know, Spaniards who have blue and green eyes, etc., that probably is the Celtic heritage. And then, in addition to the Celtic people, right, you had the Greeks who were there in the Mediterranean that the bottom of Spain touches, and they came and started with emporias, right, where they tied to the term emporium, like a market where you buy and sell goods. So the Greeks established colonies in southern Spain early on. And then in addition to that, you had the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were from Lebanon. They were known as like the middlemen merchant people of the Mediterranean, buying at one market all throughout the Mediterranean of Southern Europe and Northern Africa and selling somewhere else. And so you have Phoenician influence and migration and interaction in Spain as well. And then in addition to that, of course, for the longest time, you've had the people of North Africa. And as you probably know, the Sahara Desert is such a formidable obstacle in Africa that they don't attribute the people of North Africa, or at least many of them, to the same historical and biological roots as those of sub-Saharan, below the Sahara Desert, Africa, right? That oftentimes a history of sub-Saharan Africa begins with a Bantu-speaking people, black-skinned, and with North Africa, it does not. So, for instance, there's a mysterious people that's written about from one civilization to the next, and to this day, we don't know too much about them, but they were known as the Berbers, Berbers. And, you know, the Strait of Gibraltar goes down very far so that it's not much of a stretch to the northern tip of North Africa. So it stands to reason that, you know, people are going to migrate. From time to time, people are going to attack with their invading armies. And it worked in both directions. So the Berbers, right? And then after the Berbers, right? The Phoenicians from Lebanon formed a civilization mixing with the Berber people, and they became known as the Carthaginians. And you probably have heard of Hannibal and his elephant army, who took on Rome's army. That's them. And so you have the Carthaginians, and we know that there was migration and trade interaction and so forth, and also biological participation of men and women marrying one another and procreating, etc., from North Africa amongst the Berbers and Carthaginians. And then, of course, you have the conquest of Rome by like 200 BC. And the Romans, right? They called it. They split it in half. Hispania, hither and thither is how they translate the Latin. Basically, the closer Spain and the further Spain. And there, right? We're going to get into it, how they colonized the Iberians of Spain. So the Romans clearly intermarried with them, lived there, took up much of their land in the form of land ownership, kept presidios or army forts present there in Spain, etc. And then usually the narrative goes next to the fall of Rome and you had the Visigoths, or the Western Goths. And the Visigoths were Germanic, right? And they're going to, it's interesting, it doesn't happen too often in history, but kind of like the Scandinavians, right? The Vikings from Norway and Finland, etc., how they conquered some of Christian Europe, continental Europe, but then they themselves, as the winners, largely assimilated to the conquered population that they had colonized. That doesn't happen that often, right? Usually it's the opposite. And this is an exceptional case as well. The Visigoths under Rodrigo and other kings that they had, they actually assimilated quite a bit to the people of Spain that they conquered, and they kept a lot of things Roman. So literally, their constitution, they pretty much wrote the Latin, what was it, the Lex Hortensia, the Roman constitution. They pretty much emulated that constitution to the letter. Their language, Germanic, mixed with the Latin of the Romans, formed the Romance language, the beginning of it, of Castilian or Spanish. And so they're going to rule until 711, from like the 400s through 711. And then you have the Moors, right, of North Africa. And by that time, a lot of Arabic people had come to live and procreate with the ancient Berbers, with Carthaginians, and other more indigenous people of North Africa. And they're going to raise an army under Ibn al-Tariq, and they're going to cross the Strait of Gibraltar and conquer most of Spain. And they called it Al-Andalus, from what we get the term Andalusia, one of the southern provinces of Spain to this day. So from 711, you're going to have a combination of, they called it convivencia, coexistence between the two peoples, and fighting, which was known as the Reconquista, as the Spaniards trying to reconquer their own land from the Muslim Moors. Okay, so at any rate, when you look at all that migration and war and conquest, etc., right, and trade, to me, I just wanted to convey that there's really no such thing as like a very homogeneously, a pure Spaniard. Okay, so that was it's kind of a watered down thesis. Like I said, it was more something that I just wanted my students to be aware of, as far as the Spanish and their history, more than any kind of intelligent argument. Okay, so to treat the Spaniards as just the typical white European country coming and colonizing the Americas, that's too simplistic. Then we have, number two ironies of Spanish colonization. And it's pretty straightforward, right? So one irony would be, is that remember we went over this, I believe, in the Native American assignment last week, is there are certain criteria that the Europeans used to evaluate how civilized a people are, right? So the first one we talked about was manipulation of the environment. They believe, right, and anthropology has kind of supported these assumptions, that mankind was initially in small bands and hunter-gatherers. And then eventually, right, man began to make hybrid plants and grow them as crops. And that was known as the Neolithic or farming revolution, or new stone tool revolution. And then after that, you kind of have Maslow's hierarchy of needs come into effect, right? That once people were able to congregate in great numbers and feel a sense of safety and have plenty of food, then they could look to higher order priorities, right? Beyond just the basics of filling your stomach and having shelter. So we talked about, right, like if you're going to have widespread mass cultivation of crops, you're probably going to need some type of autocratic ruler who bosses and orders the people and coerces them and organizes them into doing the farming that they do. And he's usually going to surround himself with some type of an aristocracy or nobility, usually related to him. Then they're going to have to worry about someone coming and stealing their crops during harvest time. So they need to build an army. And then they also, right, because of the vagaries of weather and climate, just rainfall, the soil, they develop a religion as well as a religious hierarchy to try to better ensure their odds, right, of being protected from disease, from attack, and mostly from drought and not being able to eat from the crops that they're growing. And then, of course, people are going to be looked to higher things and want finer things in life. So you develop an artisan class. And the artisans are the skilled workers. And they begin to, fashion pottery, tools, furniture, nice clothing, etc. And you have the beginnings of aesthetics, right, in culture. And aesthetics is a love of beauty. And so people are going to begin to form a written language and write poetry and literature. They're going to, in mythology, they're going to have artists and sculptors, etc., right? And develop their arts and sciences. And then, of course, they will advance technologically. So hence, right, manipulation of the environment, a complex society developed, arts and sciences developed, technology developed, and then the last one is religion, which they didn't stand a chance to meet up to the Europeans' criteria, right? But at any rate, I try to say one criterion at a time how the Spanish piggybacked and received those accoutrements of civilization from other people. All right. So they likely received a coinage and a money-based economy, a currency-based economy from the Greeks, as well as the Phoenicians. They received an alphabet and a written language from the Phoenicians. All right. They may have received farming from the get-go from the Celtic people, as I mentioned. That's still up in the air. They were tied to other markets and received finer goods of adornment, etc., from the Phoenicians. And then you see here, regarding law, language, and religion, the Spanish colonizers would incessantly contend that their civilizing contributions to the Americas brought much advancement to the hemisphere. All three, according to historians like William Phillips and Carla Phillips, have been heavily influenced by, if not borrowed from, Rome. So like I said, Spanish law, it was known as the Siete Partidas, is very, very much modeled after the Roman Lex Hortensia. All right. Christianity came in the first few centuries AD to Spain in the midst of the Roman Empire. All right. And Spain actually had one emperor of Rome. It was Theodosius the first, and he was a hardcore Catholic. So at any rate, right, then also the development of architecture, aqueduct systems and irrigation and running water, the grid system for streets and buildings, and the development of cities. They got that from Rome. The Romans showed them how to do that. All right. And then you have the Moors, right? And Ibn al-Ramad the third, as the eventually they're going to call themselves more than the governor or the Basha of Spain. They're going to call themselves the Caliph because they're going to break from the Umayyad Caliphate eventually and form their own Spanish Caliphate. So I don't remember if Ibn al-Ramad III was known as merely the governor, the Basha, or if he was known as the Caliph. But at any rate, with his seat in Cordoba, he initiated a Renaissance, and he brought in the best writers and poets, musicians, mathematicians, inventors, etc., there to Cordoba. And that included native Spanish Catholics who were there, conquered by him, in Moorish Spain. So a lot of that which the Spaniards received, academically, Renaissance wise, they received from the Moors, right, and their conquest of Spain. And not to mention gunpowder, the crossbow, just those two alone were of immense magnitude in helping the Spaniards defeat the Aztec and other tribes. And they got those from the Moors. Okay. Which leads me to the second irony is the Spaniards, right? When they conquered the Americas, they almost carbon copied the manner by which they colonized the Americas after the manner in which they themselves had historically been conquered. So the very tactics that the Romans and other colonizers of ancient Spain had conquered them, the very methods that they used, they pretty much emulated those same methods when much later they colonized the Americas. So I find that to be a second irony. Okay. So soldiers told that they would be entitled to land and the enforced labor of those that they conquered, right? In an almost kind of feudal vassal type manner. The Romans called it latifundia, and the Spanish later will call it encomienda. It's virtually the same system. All right. The few windows that were open up to rise socioeconomically were largely through religion or through the military. And that's what the Spaniards allowed in the Americas, and that's what the Romans had allowed with them. Also, the Romans procreated with the colonized population, women with whom they chose, and sometimes they chose to acknowledge the sons and daughters for that matter, but just the daughters couldn't do anything politically, obviously. But sometimes they would choose to acknowledge their own children with those women, and sometimes they wouldn't. But in the cases in which they did, right, they would use their connections to have these, quote, half-breed, because yes, they use that term, these half-breed kids, sons, opportunities to join, to get education, to become a political official, to become an officer in the military, etc. So that which the Romans did to them, the Spanish did the same thing with the Native Americans. Now, granted, I will make one exception that was not emulated, is the Romans, right? They were content as long as you burned an effigy in loyalty to the emperor, they allowed other religions. Okay. And of course, as long as you paid tribute and paid your taxes, etc. And then the Spaniards, right? They're going to be in virtue of Pope Alexander VI, papal bulls. They're going to pretty much try to force as many Native Americans as possible to become Roman Catholic Christian. Okay, so the Romans hadn't done that, but the Spanish did. That was one difference. So at any rate, yeah, you have all that happening, and to me, those are two ironies, right, with Spain. Number three, a lot of people will contend with this one. And to be honest, I personally do quite a bit also. But it's such a popular interpretation that I felt like you needed to hear it. You needed to read it. Okay? And so I give it nevertheless. So please, when you read this one, I don't know about taking it with a grain of salt, but at least be wary of it. Okay? And remember, sometimes there can be, you know, an element of truth to something, but not completely, right? So it could be, you know, kind of almost partially true. So with number three, let's see here. The Spaniards carried their holy war ethos across the Atlantic. Okay. They are going to have um, some centuries from 711 to 1492 in which there is not a lot of documented warfare, in which there was genuine convivencia, right? Coexistence, living with one another, the Muslim Moor leaders and the Spanish Catholic subjects, right, in their own land. You also have cases of Spanish Catholic local princes siding and allying themselves with more Muslims against their rival Spanish Catholics, right? And so the truth is more complex than number three intimates. Okay. Sometimes, like I said, Spanish Christians fought one another and fought alongside Muslim Moors and Arabs against their fellow Christian nemesis or enemies. Sometimes, like I said, there was coexistence, peaceful coexistence. Yes, the Spaniards had to pay a special tax. Yes, the Spaniards had to engage from time to time in public works against their will because they were not Muslim and not Moors or Arabs. Uh, Nevertheless, right, they were still able to practice their religion as Catholics. They still were able to work their way up quite a few different Moor leaders' administrations. It wasn't just Ibn al-Ramad III who allowed non-Muslims to rise up in his bureaucracy if they were talented. Okay, so it wasn't always terrible. This Moorish rule over them, and so hence there wasn't always fighting. But you have, certain people that made themselves known as almost holy warriors. Okay, you have at least three popes that I've read of who sanctioned the Spanish and their rebellion against their Moorish leaders as a Catholic sanctioned holy and just war. Okay, so that they were actually encouraged by at least three different popes. And so it seemed that geography had a lot to do with it. The places furthest from Cordoba, and as you may know, Cordoba is kind of in southeastern Spain. So up in the northwest, where you have the Pyrenees Mountains, those tended to be the first areas that the Spanish local rulers were able to fight off the Muslim leaders' troops and gain a semblance of independence in their local area. Okay, and so yeah, you had Sancho, you had oh gosh, I had once known the names pretty well, but these different local leaders, they developed like literature, commemorating and lionizing or praising these local Spanish petty kings for their fight against the Moors. Okay, especially as they wrote it later on. So at any rate, by 1492, right, the Muslims had been confined to just basically Salamanca and Cordoba in southeastern Spain. And at that time, the joint monarchs, Isabel of Castile, who was the stronger one, Castile was the strongest Spanish region, arguably at that time, and Ferdinand of Aragon are going to team up and marry, and they decide that they're going to finish the Reconquista, right? The reconquest from the Moors. And so they attacked Salamanca and then Cordoba, and the last Moorish leader fled the country in 1492, in the summer of 1492. And there to see this, to witness the end, was Christopher Columbus. And of course, he wasn't a Spaniard. He was a Genoese from Genoa of Italy, but yet he made his deal with the Spaniards because they agreed to partially subsidize his voyage and expected profits in return. And so he went there to meet Ferdinand and Isabella, and he saw them gain the keys to Cordoba, the Alhambra, the Muslim palace, And there was great euphoria in Spain that we kicked the Moors out. Hooray for Christianity and the Catholic Church. Now the Spaniards have their own country again, etc. And so, of course, he left that summer and reached the Caribbean by October 11th. And so the timing, right, of finishing the reconquest of Spain and coming to the Americas, I'm saying that that had to have affected the mentality and the behavior of the Spaniards when they came here. So, for one, right, I know this is just symbolic, but I still think that symbolism matters. Is during the Middle Ages, when they were kind of having a contentious century against the Moorish leaders, they supposedly found the body of St. James in Santiago de Compostela in that city of Spain. So then it just kind of evolved so that Spaniards would go across their own country on pilgrimages to come see the body of James, right, of Santiago, James in Spanish. And he ended up becoming their patron saint of holy war against the Moors. Okay. So the Spanish cavalry, right, they'd get ready to go into battle and they would do their Catholic genuflect, the sign of the cross, and they would say, Santiago con nosotros, right? James with us. And they'd go to fight their patron warrior against the infidel. When they fought, right, according to conquistadors like a guy named Castillo, he said that they did the same thing against the Aztec. Do the sign of the cross, say Santiago with us, and go into battle against the Aztec. All right. And so what I'm saying is to the Spaniards, they
Hello? We can't hear you. No, it's been a minute.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, perfect.
Oh my goodness. All right.
It's been like maybe 8 minutes, 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, no, you're good.
All right. So with this, right, I was saying that the other part in which they tie the Reconquista to the conquest of the Americas, and I think a lot of people find this part of the argument relatively rational, that it makes sense, is that most of those, right, Isabella opened up this beginnings of kind of a barbaric form of capitalism, where she said, okay, instead of under the mercantilist system, where you have to have the right connections to get the right papers to go trade in the right commodities, she said, anybody willing to risk his own money and risk his own life to go and either go forward and find empty land in the Americas. They literally use that term, tierra vacía, empty land, or if you conquered a pagan civilization, right, as a conquistador or conqueror, you would be rewarded with minor noble status, known as an hidalgo. You could be granted an encomienda, the forced labor of those that you had conquered. And if you found empty land going forward, you were given the status of adelantado, like going adelante, going forward, and you were basically the virtual governor of that empty land. Columbus was termed adelantado on the uninhabited islands of the Caribbean. So at any rate, those who took that offer, right, were oftentimes the second and third sons of hidalgos from Extremadura. And that makes sense because, right, in Extremadura, that was the last region in which the Reconquista against the Muslim Moors was finished. And the Sultan or Caliph fled the country from Cordoba. Okay. Uh, then you have the Mayorasco, the Hijo Mayor, the oldest son, inherits everything from the dad. So hence the second and third sons, right? They witness their dad fighting a non-Catholic, succeeding in battle, and getting rewarded with a better lifestyle and more power and more wealth and more opportunities, more prestige, right? Through the use of violence as a soldier. And that dad gives them a better lifestyle. They get a taste for that, but then their oldest brother gets everything. So hence they want to go and emulate their dad and continue that holy war in the Americas and receive Hidalgo status, etc. in the Americas. Okay. So at any rate, like I said, I think saying a very neat narrative of the Reconquista made religious zealots out of the Spaniards, and that they had a full 700-year crusade, and they were on the heels of that when they came here. No, it's not that simplistic, right? Like I said, there were literally centuries during those 700 years of Moor rule in Spain, in which the Spaniards were peacefully coexisting with their Muslim leaders. Okay, but at the same time, I would make the argument that any narrative, if anybody put together a paper, published a book on the Spanish conquest, to me, there's no way that you should completely omit the Reconquista, as if it has no bearing, no relevance at all to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Okay, so I feel like it's somewhere in the middle, personally. Right, am I on the same number? See if I skipped. Sorry. All right, so this is all number 3. Okay, I guess that's it for this one. Okay, and notice the requerimiento, right? That one was scary. Uh, because remember, according to the papal bulls of Alexander VI, the Pope, right, at Tordesillas in Portugal, uh, he said that it was a mandate, right? That you have the Pope's blessing, Spain and Portugal, to conquer the Americas against non-Christian, non-Catholic pagans, but you must convert them and save their souls. Okay, that's what the Alexandrine bulls, papal bulls, dictated. But notice it doesn't say how, by what methods to convert them. So the conquerors, these were no priests, they were no friars or missionaries, right? These are secular soldiers. So some of them would put it upon themselves to try to forcefully convert the natives that they conquered. And arguably the most brutal manner in which some of them tried to do so was the requerimiento, the requirement. They would have a scribe read from the Nicene Creed back in the 300s about the basic beliefs about the Holy Trinity and the sacraments in the church, right? Have him read from the Nicene Creed in Spanish, and the indigenous people can't understand it. Sometimes they had an interpreter, sometimes they didn't. And tell the indigenous people they have 24 hours to accept those beliefs and the true faith of the Catholic Church, or they will face holy war. Okay, so sometimes it got intense. It became violent. So I'm almost hinting on that one. Right. So I'm almost hinting on number 3 that that the Spaniards, right? It's they have a term for it. It's called historicism. When you are a product of your historical environment. So I'm almost hinting that the Spaniards, uh, their their mentality, their worldview, right, even their behavior, were largely influenced by that reconquest and that holy war. All right, the Black Legend. All right, the idea of the Black Legend is that the Spaniards were exceptionally awful colonizers in the early modern era compared to the English, the French, the Dutch, or whoever else. Okay, so much so that they serve today as a perfect anti-model. So hence you see certain characteristics of the Spaniards, and it reinforces your desire to live in a world of the exact opposite of those characteristics. They show us what not to be, how not to be. Okay. And then there was a Julian, can't remember his last name, but he said, oh, this is all a black legend. This is all a dark lie about us as Spaniards. And the name stuck, the term stuck. So that's what the black legend means, what it alludes to, okay? Is that the Spaniards were so exceptionally awful as colonizers that today they serve as a perfect anti-model. All right. Usually the negative characteristics attributed to them are that they were religiously fanatic and intolerant. They were physically brutal. They were exploitative and taking advantage of and exploiting and oppressing the Native Americans that they conquered, and that their society was inequitable. And remember, inequitable, it mostly means politically and economically that your society is imbalanced in an unfair manner. That a few people receive most of the power, most of the prestige, most of the resources at the expense of the many. Okay, so those are usually the negative attributes associated with the Spanish in the Black Legend. All right. Now, this Black Legend of them being so awful was actually somewhat emanated from a Spaniard himself. Okay, a little bit ironic. He was a clergyman, and his name was Bartolome de las Casas. His dad was the scribe for Christopher Columbus. He came later and witnessed the kind of cleaning up process of the Spaniards in the Caribbean. He went to Mexico. He traveled to, I don't know if he traveled to Peru. I know that he met with Marcos de Niza, and Marcos de Niza was in Peru when the conquest happened. So he has interviews as his main source of credibility. And then in some cases, like in the Caribbean and in Mexico, parts of Mexico, he was an eyewitness to some of this. Okay. And in his accounts, he says, right, that the Spaniards were just absolutely atrocious. Okay. And it's known as a brief history or a short account of the destruction of the Indies. So bear with me here as I try to quickly translate a few of his. This is Literatura Hispanoamericana, put together by David William Foster. It's a Spanish literature book. And the very first person is Las Casas. Okay. My Spanish is a little rusty. It says here on page 2, he said he calls the Native Americans meek sheep, ovejas mansas. Okay. Then he says, where is it? Oh, the very first page, his opening paragraph. He says here, the Spaniards are building up and overflowing the wrath of God for all of their iniquity, all of their injustice, all of their violence, and all of their tyranny. Yes, those who call themselves Christians in the Indies, because above everything else, they have lost their fear of God. They've lost their fear of the king. They have lost even knowledge of themselves. Okay. As they carried on their cruel, I don't know what estragos are, but matanzas are massacres, their destruction, their depopulating of the regions, their robberies, their violence, and their tyranny. And he likens them to lions and tigers looking for whom they could devour. In this one right here, they engage in a massacre, and it says the meek sheep natives were going forth crying, asking the Spaniards, or pidiendo, pedir. I would almost translate that as like almost like begging. They're right, asking or begging of the Spaniards mercy, misericordia. But no mercy did they receive. They burnt them alive. They beheaded them. They killed them with crossbows. And the list goes on and on. So at any rate, in this, right, on number 1, I am adhering to the Black Legend. I'm trying to sum up that book by Las Casas and showing how the Spaniards demonstrated all of those negative qualities during the conquest of the Americas. First, that they were religiously intolerant. Second, that they were physically brutal. Thirdly, that they manipulated and oppressed and exploited the Native Americans for labor. And fourthly, that they established I don't go much on the last one. I do on another number coming up, that they established an inequitable society that was imbalanced and unfair. You see here, the Spaniards hunted them on horses and with dogs, enslaving those whom they didn't kill. The list goes on and on. He has an infamous part where he says that the Spaniards made bets as to who could slice a man in two with one blow of his sword. You have them taking babies out of Native American women's hands and throwing the babies into the river. Just awful, awful stuff could be found in this book. They found gold in the Cibao region of Cuba. They also found it in parts of Hispaniola, which is today Dominican Republic, and Haiti. They share the island. But at any rate, they started a policy whereby they mandated that the natives, certain times of the year, work in the mines to find them gold. And when they found their allotment of gold for the Spaniards, they would receive a copper coin on a necklace as evidence that they had done their part. So if they were found at a certain time of the year by a certain time without that copper necklace, they were to have their foot cut off. Just crazy stuff. If I were to do the Black Legend on present U.S. territory, I would probably do it on New Mexico. Don Juan de Oñate in 1599 came into New Mexico and right away did a theatrical showing of the reconquest of Spain and fighting the infidel Muslim. Then they brought out the scribe and he read the requerimiento and gave them a 24-hour ultimatum. The Navajo and the other tribes that were there in New Mexico, they did not accept it, so immediately fought them. Then there was resentment after he won. Then he brought in the Franciscans to force the natives onto missions. Some of the Franciscans in the New Mexico missions were known for certain depredations. For instance, I hate to bring it up, but there was one known to be a pedophile. And so when a drought ensued, the Spaniards lost the respect and fear of the Navajo and other tribes because they came and said that they have the power of the true God and their true God is bringing them rain. And that worked for a while. It just so happened that it did. But then there was a drought. What do you know? After all these instances of physical brutality and sexual predation and so forth. And so the natives started doing rain dances, their old indigenous rain dances. And then they severely whipped them and punished them in front of everybody else, saying you cannot revert back to your pagan idolatry. And so in 1680, under a guy named Pope, there was a great rebellion. And according to sources, on that given day in 1680, that there was not left a single Spaniard in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They had either been killed or they had run away for their lives. And that allegedly pedophile priest, they crucified him in the cathedral. Crazy stuff. Yeah, there's a good book on it called When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away, by a guy named, I think, Gutierrez. So at any rate, this is the Black Legend. Las Casas, he symbolizes it in his book. All right, so look for details in it. The number 2 is Native American agency. And remember, agency states, right, that as a demographic that has historically been depicted as victimized in the conflict history books, right? That they don't want the story to end there. To them, it's kind of condescending, that they're almost like, childlike in their passivity and becoming victimized by a colonizer. So what they want is they want to also demonstrate that they were human agents like anybody else, that even though they may have politically, economically, and socially lost the, quote, conquest and encounter and colonization of the Americas, that they still made decisions that matter. All right. So what I do is I show evidence, firstly, of how formidable they were as a foe. So, for instance, I go over the attempted Spanish conquest of Florida. So you have Ponce de Leon, you have Panfilo de Narvaez, and I think at least two others who were given permission to become like the adelantado, the governor of the conquered Florida by the Spanish authorities. And instead, they died. Instead, they were killed. They failed. There were some very formidable, powerful, heavily populated confederacies of Native Americans in Florida. And they put up a good fight for quite some time. And that's where you get the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca, right? Head of a cow. He was under Panfilo de Narvaez when they lost, and he jumped onto a raft with a black slave named Esteban, and he and Esteban made it to the Gulf of Mexico and Texas, and they were quickly enslaved by a native tribe, sold to another tribe, and then somehow he convinced them that he was a religious healer. He claims that he was able to put his hands on people as a Catholic and pray for their sickness to go away, and the natives bought it. So that he thereby earned his freedom, and he and Esteban continued to travel their way toward Mexico from whence they had come. And they developed like this large following, this entourage, according to his famous autobiography. But sadly, as they're heading toward what would be the Mexican border or so forth today, Spaniards saw them coming, and they looked, even Cabeza de Vaca, they looked native in their attire and their basic, clothing and appearance. So they were attacked by the Spaniards. Cabeza de Vaca and Esteban lived, but a lot of their native followers did not. And it broke Cabeza de Vaca's heart. And so he writes this kind of emotional, dramatic autobiography, and it took Europe by storm. And I believe it was called Naufragio, and Naufragio is shipwreck. All right. I talk about New Mexico in here. Talk about Baja California. So at any rate, you get the point with number two, okay, is that the natives, they not only fought back when the Spaniards tried to conquer them, but once they were formally conquered, right, they didn't just give up. There were certain things that they did rather effectively. Excuse me. One was that they made the friars and the missions negotiate and compromise with them on multiple issues. All right. So for one, right, the Spaniards literally changed elements of baptism, confirmation, and other sacraments to make them more familiar to the Native Americans, more familiar with their old customs. Okay. Also, when it came to labor, the natives negotiated. They made the missionaries negotiate, because they would have times, right, where the local hacendados, the leaders of the local plantations, as well as the soldiers at the local presidio, would demand the natives' labor, their help in constructing something, or in doing farm work. So literally, they would compete and fight with the missionaries over who got to use the natives' labor. The natives took advantage of that, and they began demanding pay and certain privileges to whomever they were willing to work for. So they were no dummies. They used their human agency to take advantage of the situation of the acute demand for their labor. They also begrudgingly were allowed times of the year where they could leave the mission and go back and visit their families. Prior to this, right, the Spaniards said no way. Because, of course, right, with a fancy word, soteriology, the study of Christian notions of salvation and making it to heaven. With the Catholics, right, you can never be quite sure where you're going to make it. And it's a constant battle of having your sins forgiven by Christ and doing proper penance and repentance and good works, etc. So hence, right, to them, the natives, they were never safely destined for heaven. It all depended how they ended the race. So hence, if they went back to their families and villages, they were afraid they would go back to their old religious pagan ways. So they used to send the Comandante, Guadalupe Vallejo, that Vallejo is named after them to forcefully capture them and force them back to the mission. But that eventually changed, and they begrudgingly allowed the natives, because of demands and threats, that they allowed the natives to leave certain periods of the year. So the natives, they had their own agency, okay, and they used it. The number 3, this one I did with a smile on my face, okay, a genuine smile on my face. I don't know that I buy this one at all, but I thought it was interesting. So it's Toward the Setting Sun by David Boyle, and I tried to summarize that book. All right. What he says here is that Columbus's back was against the wall. He virtually had no other options, no other alternatives, and he felt nearly compelled to go and discover new lands and conquer, etc., because of the poverty of his family. All right. So the bankers, the big, Centuroni family. It starts with a C. I can't remember the other big name. But anyway, these big Venetian families of bankers. The term banker comes from the term bench or table in Italian. They would come and sit at a table in Venice, primarily, and other port cities of Italy and other countries of Europe. And they have a long line of people, almost like the Shark Tank, come in, and they would ask each person, why do I want to lend my money to you? So, of course, you had to convince him that it was in his best interest, not yours, to lend that money to you. And what Columbus supposedly learned was the ideal answer is to be, I will do whatever you tell me to. I'll do whatever you want with your money. You tell me how to make it grow, how to gain profit, how to get dividends from your investment, and I'll do it. Say the word. So that's exactly what he did. He became a desperate mercenary. He saw his dad trying to work as an artisan, a skilled worker, and never escaped poverty. And his family, as a young kid, never escaped poverty. And he wanted better for his family than what his dad had done. So he learns to play this game, this brutal game, right? And so hence, when he told these bankers that he would do whatever they say, he did. So hence, he went to one of the big port cities of the Ivory Coast of Africa to pick up slaves. There was Elmina. There was Elmina and Luanda were a couple of the biggest ports. And I think he went to one of those and picked up slaves and brought them somewhere to be sold. He went into the quote Indies, like Indonesia, and he fought over a few islands to be able to grow coffee on those islands, primarily against both the Dutch and the Portuguese. All right. In one instance, his ship was blown to bits, and he drifted on driftwood for quite some time before he was rescued. So he nearly died because this was very Darwinian. You go to the quote Indies, right? And these are not members of the official navy of these countries. These are privateers. These are private dudes who are putting cannon on their ships and fighting it out to take over these islands and grow some cash crop or find some mineral wealth and take it and sell it for profit. Okay. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to almost blame the system and say poor Columbus just felt like he had to play the game. He did what he was told. He did what he had to extricate his family from poverty. And so hence, right, Isabella gave him a pretty high amount. I can't recall anymore what it was of maravedis. That's some type of currency. But he owed her a lot. And so when he went to the Caribbean, right, he has his famous first letter back to her husband, Ferdinand. And it sounds so callous. He brags about the beauty of the vegetation and the animals and the weather and the ocean and the people. But then he says, what would you like, Ferdinand? Do you want slaves? I'll capture as many as I can and bring them back to Spain. Do you want certain commodities? I'll take it, whether they trade it to me or not. So it sounds very callous, right? But to Columbus, right, he's already thinking ahead. He had 4 famous voyages there. He's already thinking ahead to his second voyage, and he's going to need financial help, even on the second one. And so he better pay back that loan, and even to make the crown happy, make some profit for the crown if he gets a second chance, if he wants a second chance. So hence, that's why he offered to catch slaves and bring them back to Spain. So like I said, I don't know what I personally think of that. I think it's kind of letting him off the hook too easily, but that's the thesis. He was a quote commoner willing to do someone else's dirty work so he can get his family out of poverty. All right. And remember what I said about historicism. Okay. Spain was enslaved by the prejudices of her time. Remember, there was no secular education system. There was no separation of church and state, right? Spaniards were brought up under the secular diocese of priests and bishops and archbishops, etc., right? It was expected of all, even those whose faith was really light on them personally. It culturally was expected. You go to mass and you perform all the sacraments of the church, right? So you're baptized as a baby. As you come at least, anywhere from 7 to 12, you have your confirmation and so forth, right? You go to confession and do your penance, etc., or reconciliation. So at any rate, they're raised hardcore Catholic. The Catholic popes had no problem with making these papal bulls or edicts that mandated things in people's personal lives, that mandated decisions made by their political leaders, which would be unheard of today, right? They didn't have the scientific revolution yet. They didn't have the Enlightenment yet. And they didn't have classical liberalism for sure yet. So with the Enlightenment, right, it's against being credulous, just believing what you're told simply because you're told it. You should question everything, right? Scientific revolution, same thing. The empirical method of getting to truth, right? Using your 5 senses and experimentation, separating variables, engaging in inductive reasoning from the results, etc. That hadn't come yet. The rights of all human beings, including the right to their own religion in the Enlightenment? Not yet. And then classical liberalism, that to me, it's in a nutshell, right? Under an American judge. It was mainly written by John Stuart Mill in his books. But with classical liberalism, it says that the individual is and ought to be autonomous. He's independent. He's his own king. He decides what he wants to do, what he listens to, what he reads, what he believes, how he behaves. That he ought to be free and autonomous to do what he wants. And an American judge said it quite well, I think, about the only limitations to classical liberalism. As he said that your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. You can do whatever you want until you infringe upon the rights of someone else. So those type of beliefs that we take for granted now, they didn't have those movements yet. They hadn't been taught that yet. Okay? So yes, they have the Reconquest. Yes, they had a pope issuing edicts and bulls. And a lot of them, right? A lot of them who said that they wanted to improve their lives, admitted to such. A lot of them supposedly felt like that's the least they can do in return, is God saw to it that they didn't get killed in battle, that they were successful and victorious. Now they've been rewarded. So the least they can do for God, for their Pope who mandated such, for their king, right, was to make sure that those that he conquered become Christians and have their souls saved. So that kind of highly religious worldview, that was their time. That's what they grew up in. That's what they knew. Okay? Excuse me. And then also, right, I have some Bible verses here. Deuteronomy chapter 32, 106 Psalm, 1 Corinthians, right? They refer to other, quote, mythical gods outside the Bible as demons disguised as fake gods to lead people astray. So hence, right, the Spaniards literally felt like the Aztec, the Navajo, and all these tribes were unknowingly worshiping Satan himself in the guise of some made-up god, but truly they were worshiping a demon. So there was a sense, right, that they were doing the natives a favor by saving their souls, a grand favor. So please go through this and read it all, okay, when you have time. Then number 5, Spain was just quite inequitable. So economically, you had the Casa de Contratación, or House of Trade. They decided who alone had the right connections and sometimes paid the right amount of money to receive papers and hence permission to trade in the most lucrative products. And the most lucrative products most of the time were human slaves, sadly, chocolate, sugar, coffee, indigo, cotton, etc. So the average person had no chance of trading in the highly lucrative trades because they mandated the ports where you had to leave and return to. They had customs officials who were waiting to make sure you had the right papers. If you didn't, they would confiscate all that you had on your boat, right? And then also, economically, the conquistadores were granted encomiendas, large grants of land, and the forced labor of those that they conquered. right? Well, in 1542, Charles V tried to put an end to that with his new laws of Burgos. He declared that for the present generation, because right when the conquistadores died, they gave the rights to that encomienda, not just that land, but to the forced labor of the natives. They gave it to a son, and it was inherited like a new American aristocracy, starting with the conquerors. And so in 1542, Charles V formally put an end to it and said that the present generation of sons, when they die, the encomienda is over, and the crown takes that land and sets the natives free. Charles V had good intentions, but there was rebellion in multiple regions of Latin America over it. And in fact, in South America, they even killed the viceroy, the vice king, the highest ranking dude there. He literally was killed. So Charles V gave in and decided not to try to enforce it. So despite his good efforts, in future generations, the sons and sons and sons of these conquerors continue to enjoy the forced labor and large land tracts of their conqueror ancestors. All right. Now, were you allowed scraps off the table? Yeah, if it wasn't a specially set aside uh, a lucrative product that I already tried to mention, then you were allowed to trade in it. Okay. And it didn't matter if you were mestizo, like half indigenous and half Spanish, or any other type of quote mixed race, casta, any mixed race of people, or castizo. But still, right? Economically, that when you think about our capitalist system, that's unfair. That's unfair that only select dudes could make the money off the major lucrative stuff, and that only ancestors to conquerors had access to vast tracts of land and laborers for free. Okay. Then politically, the Spaniards brought in a vice king known as a viceroy. He executed the laws of of the Americas, right? And by the way, the laws themselves were written by the Council of Indies, which was just a handful of hand-picked dudes back in Spain, high-ranking guys. And what they did is they took the Spanish Constitution, the Siete Partidas, and they made some adaptations to it to supposedly acclimate to the different conditions of the Americas. So a handful of dudes get to write the Constitution and the law over in Spain who've never even seen the Americas. A viceroy is a Spaniard from Spain, known as a peninsular, someone from the Iberian Peninsula, comes and gets to be the viceroy to enforce them, right? Then all disputes and criminal law, etc., are held to the audiencia, and the audiencia are a group of Spanish judges, again, who have come across the Atlantic from Spain, so they're not natives of the Americas. Then most of the time, the governors were Spaniards also. All right. And then they had the hated corregidores. And remember, corregir in Spanish means to correct. So these corregidores, right, they could come in and, quote, correct or veto decisions made by the cabildos, the city councils, and the alcalde mayor, who was the mayor. Okay. They also came in with a repartimiento, and the repartimiento forced the natives certain days of the year to engage in public works, like build a church, build a bridge, a road, etc. And the natives have no choice. Okay. And then I said, granted, there are exceptions to pointing out this very, very hierarchical, inequitable Spanish dominion here in the Americas, right? For one, they maintain the same two main avenues of advancement for anyone. Okay. And matter of fact, I'm going to name a third. So the first two, right, are through the army. If you fight bravely and well as a soldier, it doesn't matter how darkly indigenous you are, you can make it up the ranks. And also, if you are seen to be a very pious person, you can make it up the ranks of the church and become a priest, bishop, missionary, etc. Okay. And thirdly, they had certificates of merit. Okay. Sometimes called certificates of whiteness. Okay. That was a gracias al sacar notes. They were called in Spanish. Thank you for letting me get out. Right. And if you saved a rich man's kid from drowning, or you did some type of heroic deed, right? They would grant you a certificate that you were to be treated as a Spaniard from Spain, regardless of what you look like and what your ethnicity really was. All right. Then also you had the juicio de or juez de residencia. And that was if from time to time a visitor general would come unannounced, put the local Spanish leader under house arrest, and offer everybody in his local environment an opportunity to bring forth any accusations of his misrule. Okay. And if it was found by the judges that he was guilty of abuse of power, he was put in chains and sent back to Spain and replaced by someone else, known as a juez de residencia or juicio de residencia. And this is known right here as the pigmentocracy chart. Okay. It was named by a Chilean anthropologist in the 70s, and the name caught on. Uh, basically, a social and sometimes even somewhat political hierarchy based upon the pigment of your skin. So if you see there, yeah, man, that's difficult to see. I don't know if I'm able to. Let me see if I could increase. Okay, I think that is a Spaniard with a native, and they have a child. It's considered a mestizo. Then that child, the mestizo, half indigenous from mom, half Spanish from dad, has a child with a Spaniard woman. Now it's gone up to a castizo. Then that child, the castizo, if he marries a Spanish woman, now he's back to a Spaniard. It's kind of funny, right? And so it's called the pigmentocracy, this hierarchy made in Spain based upon the pigment of your skin. The Spaniards were proud of their light European skin compared to the indigenous, compared to the black slaves. What I find interesting too, right? If you look at the telenovelas on the Spanish channels, right? They're soap operas. Notice how oftentimes the lawyer, the politician, the business executive are white, light skinned. Okay, that this type of you know outlook on things hasn't completely died to this day. I know I did a semester in Costa Rica, and I found a lot of people there in that country quite proud of their lighter Spanish skin and heritage, and that they had not intermarried with Indios, with natives. And you hear of that reputation also in Argentina. All right, so let's see here. And then number 6, the Spanish missions were a proverbial mixed bag. What I did, okay, is I took the major historiographical approaches to the missions and I put them all in one section. Remember, historiography is the art and science of history, the kind of school of history that you adhere to when you're writing a history book. So firstly, right, I do the old court history, defending the winners. And I show how, to an extent, there were some like Junipero Serra, right? Who Spanish friars and priests who were extremely self-sacrificing, unselfish, displayed genuine empathy and concern for their indigenous neophytes or converts, even if it was condescending, because yes, it was. There is there are a couple verses in the New Testament of the Bible where it likens newly converted Christians to children. Okay, that they have to grow up in the faith and learn proper doctrine, etc. Okay, so yes, these people did call the neophytes oftentimes their children, and that sounds awful now, but that even if there was, paternalism and condescension, that there was genuine benevolence from some of these priests. And of course, Junipero Serra was made a saint in the Catholic Church, and there were Native Americans who showed up in Carmel to protest it at the mission. Then you do a 180, right? And you do conflict history. And you show how there was physical brutality. Because remember, right, to the missionaries, the most important thing to them was that their neophytes go to heaven when they die. Their souls, right? Your lifespan here is relatively short. And so eternity is much more important. So it matters where they go, right? So when natives seem to be rebellious, clinging to their old religion, even after they're baptized as Catholic Christians, they reasoned that it was worth whipping them and physically harming them to get them to change and repent. So there was physical brutality. There was a guy named Van Kotzebue. He was a priest, and he went to a couple of the California missions, and he reported that he saw too many priests being physically violent with their neophytes. So that's a primary source, someone who saw it with his own eyes. So there's some truth to conflict history also, right? And as far as exploitation, there was a Narciso Duran in the San Jose mission, and they said he had that mission working like a well-oiled machine, a profitable machine, that the natives were taught several new trades and that they were constantly made to work so that he could sell these commodities and make money. Right? And then you have, after, praising the conquerors, then vilifying the conquerors with conflict history, then you have agency, right, that we talked about. Native Americans, they negotiated. They forced the Spanish to negotiate. Any leverage that they knew, especially the leverage for the need for their labor, they took advantage of. And they made the Spaniards give them concessions in return. Sometimes they blended their religion with that of the Spaniards. And the Spanish, friars were not happy about that. But in some cases, they felt like they had no choice. That at least, a watered down version or a paganized version of Catholicism is better than no Catholicism at all. And it's better than their rebellion, right? They refused to speak Spanish. They went on hunger strikes. They stole livestock, etc. Then the next school of historiography is when they say the Spaniards probably had sometimes some good intentions, but there was inadvertent, right? Almost accidental or not intentioned harm that they brought. So the most obvious example of that, right, is disease. I think of the Cado, Cado, in Texas. By multiple accounts, the Spaniards were delighted that the Caddo tribe was happy to convert and join the missions. But when they did, a large proportion of them died of European disease. And the Spaniards were just broken over it. They obviously didn't mean to, but their hopes and expectations were dashed by this epidemic. Then also they did damage to the ecosystem, right? They brought in pigs and cows and horses, etc., and they ate the local flora, the local plants and grasses and so forth, and trampled on plants and flowers, etc. They exhausted the soil from farming. But also ultimately, right, whether they had the most altruistic, remember, altruistic is putting the needs of others above your own, and you're genuinely, unselfishly concerned for someone else. Even those Spanish missionaries who might have been genuinely altruistic and wanting to save the native souls, right? They killed the natives' culture. They're guilty of, quote, cultural genocide. All right. And that is finally it. All right. Are there any questions or comments? You guys feel okay? Can I get a thumbs up? You guys feel okay about doing this assignment and the one prior? Thank you. Thank you, Xavier. Thank you, Olivia. All right. So that's great. All right. Yeah, I hope I'm helping out. You guys deserve to know exactly what I intended to convey by sticking it out during these Zoom meetings, right? And you'll also get your extra credit. Xavier, I'm glad that you raised your thumb. I didn't have your name down. All right, so yeah, let me make sure I have everybody. Go to the next list. I'm gonna make sure everybody that's here gets credit for such. All right, you guys have a good week, okay? I hope that you're doing okay. I'll try to get to my Canvas messages to make sure. Remember, if it's an absolute, urgency and I'm not responding, make use of that cell phone and text me, all right? But hopefully you're doing okay, and I should be fine. I think I've caught up with my emails as of yesterday, and I'll take a look at my Canvas messages next. All right, so you guys take care, okay?